Recording in progress.
The Muslim rulers, the Sunni believe that Muslim rulers should follow the Sunnah or Muhammad's example, whereas the Shia said they didn't have to only follow his example, but they needed to be descended from him. Both groups claim that the other group have distorted the meanings of various passages in the Quran. Now, of course, we know that there was 100 years war in Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants. We know that there have been disagreements historically between different Christian groups, but historically we've moved on to a different time period. The stakes are much, much higher in the Muslim world between these different interpretations. Now, as modernity begins to occur in the Ottoman Empire, it's a top-down process. In other words, the Sultan thinks, having encountered Europe, having seen that Europe is organizationally and technologically advanced compared to the Ottoman Empire, he decides that he needs to modernize his empire. The masses overwhelmingly are indifferent to the process. And although they do establish schools, those schools will train a new elite, but they won't reach many of the people in the masses who will remain not just indifferent, but illiterate and unaffected by this process of modernization. It is opposed by the ulama and the janissaries. Those are the old elites in the Turkish system. The ulama are the scholarly religious elite, and the janissaries are a military class. They oppose this, like all elites oppose changes, because this could threaten their power. When the Sultan is trying to modernize, he needs, of course, to always balance any modernization with Muslim ideas. And this leads to the emergence of new elites. And we'll be talking a little bit more about those elites as we make our way forward. Now, Egypt is a little bit different than the other countries of the region. Firstly, you'll recall that the Suez Canal, that Napoleon's, and prior to that, Napoleon's campaign were in Egypt. So Egypt is pushed along in this modernization process a little more than other places. Secondly, Egypt is quite some distance from Turkey. And so they are able to emerge as a independent power, or at least to process and proceed into their modernization in a very different way to what we see going on in Turkey. The next major turning point is World War I. World War I, the Turks fight with the Axis, together with Germany, Austria, Hungary. It's the side that loses. And one of the results of the end of World War I is the collapse of the empires. Now, it doesn't only happen to Turkey, it will happen to the Russian Empire, which collapses and is replaced by the Soviet Union. It will happen to Austria-Hungary, which will break down into separate states. But the process of breaking up the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I is going to be the most dramatic process. Now, just one piece that we've heard about that makes the news from time to time, the Armenian genocides, which happened during World War I. The Armenian genocide is carried out by Turks against Armenians. Armenians are Christians. So this is not, today when people hear the Armenian genocide, it's kind of understood as against a different ethnicity, the Armenians. But remember that the Turkish Empire is an empire that is constructed around religious identities. The Armenian church is a unique church. They are not Catholic, they are not Orthodox, they are not Protestant, they are Armenian. Like the Jews, who are both a religion and a people, so too the Armenians. Like the Jews, they are a small people. Why are the Armenians massacred and not the Orthodox and not the Catholics? Because the French and the Austrians have the Catholics' backs. Because the Russians have the Orthodox back. No one is there to defend the Armenians. And this is a window into what we will see, a breakdown of that old pluralistic Turkish system into a system where the primary identities are going to be people's religious, confessional, tribal identities. Now, if we go back to World War I, World War I is a war in which the British are doing what they can to beat the Germans and the Turks in this war. And one of the things that happens is an attempt to get the Arabs on the side of the British. And a correspondence will take place between Sir Henry McMahon, who is the British High Commissioner in Egypt, acting, of course, in the interests of His Majesty's government, not acting on his own, in a correspondence with Said Hussein bin Ali, who's the Sharif of Mecca, a descendant of Muhammad, who rules Mecca, and the British try to, in the series of letters between McMahon and Said Hussein bin Ali, they try to make promises to bin Ali in order to get his loyalty in the war effort. Bin Ali wants to establish a Muslim caliphate, an Arab caliphate, without Turkey, and frankly, without North Africa, round about the Gulf and stretching into all the way into Syria of today, Israel of today, Iraq. He wants to establish a Muslim caliphate there. The British hint at the possibility of this taking place in order to get their loyalty in the war effort. But there are disagreements because some of what he wants, Britain wants, and Britain does not want to annoy the other allies fighting in the war. And so this is never ever comes to completion, but it plants the seed of expectations in the Arabs. At the same time, well, actually, it's a few months later, an agreement is signed between Sir Mark Sykes, representing His Majesty's government of Great Britain. He's not yet a Sir. He will be knighted because of this deal. And Francois Picot, representing the Republic of France. They essentially take a map and divide up the Middle East. It's May of 1916. They understand that they are going to win this war. I don't think they think it's going to take them until 1918. They think that they're closer to the end of the war. But either way, they divide the region up into areas that will be under British rule, French rule, Russian rule, and larger areas that will be under an Arab state under French protection, a British Arab state under British protection, and Palestine, which will be under British, French, and Russian protection. Earlier on, I said the borders of the Middle East are determined by colonial powers. This, far more significantly than the letter between McMahon and Hussein, will impact on what the map of the Middle East looks like. Another turning point is November the 2nd, 1917. On November the 2nd, we don't want to do that. We want to go. On November the 2nd, 1917, a letter is released, which is called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is issued by the British Foreign Office, by Lord Balfour, who has the power. And notice that the letter is sent to Lord Rothschild, a prominent Jew who has no position in the Zionist movement, but who's recognized as a Jewish leader. And this is the letter. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Now, the Balfour Declaration is today seen as a major turning point. It's viewed by the Arab world as the moment the British sold them out and promised things to Israel, or to the Jews, which will lead to Israel. But the fact is that at the time, Jews were bitterly disappointed with this letter. And I'll draw your attention to the third line, a declaration of sympathy, not support. It's softer than support. What is sympathy? Sympathy with the aspirations is not as strong as support. If we go a little further down, the government view with favor the establishment in Palestine. Again, view with favor is not an outright support. It's a little more ambivalent. In Palestine, how much of Palestine? In 10% of Palestine? In 70% of Palestine? In all of Palestine? What are the borders of Palestine? The Turkish governmental borders or some other border? The Sykes-Picot's got completely different lines. And finally, a national home for the Jewish people, not a state. A home is a very soft term, again. Nevertheless, the Balfour Declaration, the echoes of the Balfour Declaration will go forward when the war will end. Because what happens when the war ends is there is a peace conference in Versailles, and in San Remo, there is a branch of that conference. And in San Remo, they basically strip the losers of their assets and give those assets to the victors. as a mandate. The idea of a mandate is that this will be a territory that they will later on be able to rule, but they will later on be able to have self-rule, and that you have the mandate to lead the country through that stage into becoming independent. South Africa, which was an ally of the British in this war, gets Namibia, which is, or Southwest Africa, which was a German province down there. But in our area, the division is kind of along the lines of Sykes and Picot. And so the French get what will become Lebanon and Syria, and the British get what will become Israel, Transjordan, and Iraq in this area, but also the area to the south of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states will also be part of this model. Now, the flaw is that both the British and the French will rule these mandated territories through their colonial office. So the model of running these areas will be the colonial model. The flaw in the colonial model is that the colonial model almost always used the divide and rule system. And we will see how that plays out going forward. But just before that, we will take one step back again and talk about the nation state. America is different, but Europe, most states in Europe are what we call a nation state. A group of people with a shared language, a shared territory, normally a distinct religion, national myths and history, will become a state. Now, obviously, on the margins of these states, there can be disagreements. And the most humorous of them is that there was an area round about here which both the Germans and the French have claimed. The dogs that come from that area, the Germans will call German Shepherds, and the French will call Alsatians, because they come from Alsace. So it's not perfect, but the overwhelming majority of people in a nation state share a national identity, a national language, a national history. The states that emerge in the Middle East are what we could call, just for the purposes of clarifying, a state nation. Colonial powers will draw a line on the map. Very often the lines are straight lines with a ruler that someone has drawn. We can look at the map of Iraq. Yes, along the river with Iran, it is a natural border, but its borders in the rest of the areas are lines drawn on the map by colonial powers. And the people that end up in that state are a random collection of people who happen to live in a particular area, whose primary identity the day before was not Iraqi, but was Sunni or Shiite or Druze or Yazdi or a Christian denomination. That is the building block of the nations, of the states that we have in the region. And we can see that although the area comes under control of the British and the French immediately after World War I, much of the area will only get its independence after World War II. There is an exception in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but most of the areas will only get their independence. And we again see the many, many straight lines on this map. And also some of the countries got their independence from Spain, from France, from Italy, and of course from Britain. Now, there are countries on this map that don't fit the model that I'm speaking about. Cyprus I already mentioned, but the others are Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Israel. Turkey, which once ruled this whole area, is a Muslim country, but not an Arab country. So that gives Turkey a distinctiveness to the others. Turkey also borders with Europe and has aspirations, or has at times had aspirations for Europe. Iran is also a non-Arab country. It is a Persian-speaking country. Iran is, unlike Turkey, which is Sunni, or overwhelmingly Sunni, Iran is Shiite. So that is another distinction. But both Turkey and Iran have history as countries that were not created by the colonials. Iran goes back to biblical Persia. Turkey has an empire, the Ottoman Empire, which comes into power in the first half, or the end of the 1400s. So again, a long, long history. Egypt is an Arab country, a Sunni country, but a distinct country that has an identity that dates all the way back to before the Bible. And of course, Israel is different because Israel has a Jewish majority and a Jewish identity. So these are some of the countries that will become independent after World War I, or will become functional. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Gulf states, all of the countries in North Africa, and Iran. Most of these countries are held together by colonial power. And when, earlier or later, that colonial power is thrown off, overwhelmingly, they are ruled by a strong man. Most of the countries will have kings, but very quickly in many of the countries there will be coups, the kings will be overthrown, and those countries will be held together by the Saddam Hussein or the Muammar Gaddafi type personality that will replace the colonials and will hold this disparate group of people with different identities together. And then when the so-called Arab Spring comes along and people in the West are celebrating the end of these dictators, what happens is people revert to their primary identities. They no longer remain or have a primary identity as a Lebanese or a Syrian, but rather revert to their earlier identities. Now, Egypt, like I say, is different in that Egypt has a historical identity. But if we look at the historical Egypt, which is what we see in purple, that will be divided by straight lines, we can see the map, into Egypt and Sudan. Just again, a reminder for those that have a bit of Hebrew, a word that ends with an im is a plural word. And the word for Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, because it was to Egypt. It was Upper Egypt what is Sudan, and Lower Egypt, which is today Egypt. Those areas are now separate countries. They had, and of course, bits of Ethiopia were also part of Great Egypt in its time. And that's an example, even though in these countries, as opposed to the others, you don't have the diversity. Everyone is a Sunni. Even here, it's broken up into separate countries. On the opposite extreme, we have Lebanon. Now, I will remind you that at the end of Sykes-Picot, the line was drawn. North of that line was French. South of that line was British. And when the French, excuse me, when the French rule Syria, they rule through a local ally that we call Maronites. The Maronite Church is under the Catholic umbrella. They're not quite mainstream Catholics, but they're close enough. The French could work with them, and the Maronites will be the allies of the French during the colonial period. When the French decide to leave, they do not want, the Maronites do not want to get thrown to the wolves. The Maronites are terrified that if they are left, because of the loyalty they'd shown to the French, they're going to be in big trouble. And so they persuade the French to carve a piece of Syria out and to create an independent country that exists in the Bible. We've heard of Lebanon in the Bible, but a country that doesn't exist, hasn't existed since then. Now, the areas on the map that you see in red are the Christian Maronite areas. It wasn't viable as a country. And so they extended and took a whole lot of other areas to incorporate into their state. And you'll see the dark green, which is the Shiite areas, and the light green, which is the Sunni areas, and the blue, which is the Druze areas, and then the other different minorities. Now, the Christians, the Maronites, will come up with a constitution. The United States has a constitution. Britain does not have a constitution. A constitution is not what determines a democracy. Because the constitution of Lebanon said we're going to have elections. And no matter what happens, there will always be a 6-to-5 ratio of Christians to everyone else. And we're going to have elections, and no matter what, the president with the power will always be Christian, and the prime minister will always be Sunni, and the speaker of the house will always be Druze, and the Shiites will get the short stick. This is a snapshot of 1946, but it doesn't reflect birth rates. Christians who are more educated, who have now speak French and send their children to study in France, the Christians have Western birth rates. The other sects have developing world birth rates. And by the 70s, the Christians are not the majority. And what will start to happen is a civil war that takes Lebanon from being the most affluent, the Switzerland of the Middle East in the late 60s and early 70s, to an absolute and total failed state today. Because most of these people never, ever felt complete. Most of the people that were not the red, the Christians and maybe the Greek Orthodox and other Christian denominations as well, didn't ever feel that their primary commitment was to Lebanon. Their primary commitment was as a Shiite. Their primary commitment was as a Sunni. And that's what has led as opposed to Egypt, to the implosion of Lebanon. The same phenomena occurs with less of an intensity across the rest of the region. So if we look at Syria, we can see that the majority of Syria is yellow, which is Sunni, but there is along the coast an area in which there are Shiites and Alawites. You haven't heard me mention Alawites up to now. Alawites are a tiny minority, but in Syria they're 12%. The Assad family that has ruled Syria are Alawites. The cabinet are Alawite. The generals are Alawite. The pilots are Alawite. Yes, Syria, but the power remained in a particular sect. If we look at the region, we will see that in the north, there are a group of people called the Kurds. The Kurds are Sunnis, but they are ethnically not Arabs. They're Arabic speaking, but they're a different group. They speak a different dialect. And so we can see that Syria is subdivided into all of these different groups. And that will give us a context, for example, to ISIS, because ISIS were Sunni, resentful of the fact that Syria was being ruled by the Shiite Alawite axis. If we look at Iraq, we can see that Iraq has a much, much more significant Shiite population, but it also has a large Sunni population, Sunni Arab population, and a Kurd population as well. But there are also large areas of desert in Iraq which are virtually uninhabited. And ISIS, which were attempting to create a caliphate, was in Syria and Iraq, in the yellow areas of Syria and Iraq. Now, there is a joke that we tell in Israel that when the Assad regime was teetering, as we know, it never falls, but when the Assad regime was teetering, Western media paid a lot of attention to the pro-Western rebels. In Israel, we say, well, why don't we hear about the pro-Western rebels today? One of them was killed, one of them was taken prisoner, and we don't know what happened to the other one. Because they were always more a reflection of Western hopes, Western aspirations, than they were ever a reflection of the reality. What happens to the Syrian army? It breaks down into the people that were supporting ISIS, who were the Sunnis, not all of the Sunnis, but many of the Sunnis, the people, the Druze, who were down in the south maintaining an independent area, and the Shiite Alawite group who were linked to the Shiite power in Lebanon on the coast and controlling the coast of Syria. Where were the Christians that live in Syria? Because there are Christians. The Christians that live in Syria threw their lot in with Assad because they saw what ISIS was doing. ISIS was crucifying. ISIS was burning alive. ISIS was doing terrible things to Christians, raping women. And so the Christians threw their lot made an allegiance with the Alawites, which is part of the reason why Assad is still in power in Syria, as opposed to so many of the others that have gone through these enormous upsets and changes. Let's look at another country. This is a country called Jordan. You'll remember the McMahon letter. Well, they didn't give him Saudi Arabia, but they placed the family to be this tribe, this Bedouin tribe, to be the king of Jordan, and also another son to be the king of Iraq. The one in Iraq was overthrown. The one in Jordan continues to rule, the descendants of that same family. What was unique about Jordan was that it was a large territory with hardly any people. But it was the British did not want the border of Saudi Arabia with its oil resources to be accessible to the French in Syria. And so if we look at Jordan, it's got, instead of being a sort of natural country, it's got this peculiar rectangle with no cities in it, no, really not much going on there. This is the colonial border drawn to make sure that the French, even though they were allies, you never know, we've been fighting, they fought previous wars against us, don't have access to Saudi Arabia. And by the way, they took a little piece of what should have been Saudi Arabia to give Jordan access to the Gulf. Those of you that were with me more or less this time last year went out onto the Gulf where we could see both Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. So Jordan has Bedouin population, and it also has a Palestinian population of Palestinians that left from Israel. The country of Saudi Arabia, again, a large country, much of the country is desert. The important area was the area along the Gulf, important from a religious point of view. Mecca and Medina are there, important from access to the ports, important for the exporting of oil. The creation of the country of Saudi Arabia was not given the whole of the Gulf, but the bulk of it. And then we have another group of small emirates, small kingdoms. And we all know about Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but if you look closely, there are a whole lot of other smaller kingdoms, some of them that are not even territorially contiguous. If you look at Fujairah, which is in purple, we'll see that there are 4 different pieces of it, separated one from another. These countries were oil rich. The Allies, the Europeans, the British hold on to them for much, much longer. And eventually, each tribal chieftain gets to rule a different area, but they come together as a united Arab Emirates, kind of a political construction. They're each independent, but they function within a united Arab Emirate. And that's an important point that perhaps I haven't emphasized enough up to now, because not only are the countries of the region divided along religious, ethnic lines, but also along tribal lines. The tribal identity is still very significant in the region. And there is an Arabic saying, which I will translate as follows: my brother and I against my cousin. My cousin and I against my clan. The members of my clan against my tribe. My tribe against the neighboring tribe. So there are, even within Sunni, this is a completely Sunni area, there are other identities that come to the fore. That is what enables certain countries like the Gulf states, which are small and fairly monolithic, each of the emirates are a separate tribe, to function because of in a different way than a country like Lebanon that is trying to juggle all of these different entities. Now, we're almost finished with the formal part of the lecture, but a word about Iran. Iran was, and I think there are probably some people in this lecture that will remember when the Shah was alive and ruling Iran. Iran was very modern. Iranian fashion, you know, Iranian beaches, Iranian fashion. Iran was an example of what the Middle East could have been. There was a strong pushback, a religious pushback against this by the Shiite elite who overthrew the liberal, maybe not politically, but liberal culturally, Shah, and have since then maintained a rigorous Shiite state. And we've all heard just recently, the stories of women being beaten in the street for not having their heads covered, and so on. Now, overwhelmingly, Iran is a Persian country. We see the light green, which is Persian. But if we pay attention to all those other colors on the map, we can see that, in fact, even Iran, which is overwhelmingly Persian and overwhelmingly Shiite, has other minorities within it. And I know that in the United States, there are minorities and there are tensions, and have been, over the years, up and down tensions between black and white, or between Asian Americans and other Americans, or whatever it happens to be. Those are small scale compared to the power that these religious and ethnic divisions play in the Middle East. So Iran is a very, very powerful country, but it has its weak points in that these other groups have never, ever made their peace with Persian rule. So just to recap before we end, where do loyalties lie? Ethnic, religious, confessional group would be first. Another point that we spoke less about, although Lebanon was once like that, and Iran was once like that. The Gulf states today are like that, open to Western or Eastern ideas, but at different times, Russian ideas or Chinese ideas, well, versus Islamic supremacy. That's another fault line in the region. The gap between the elites and the people. Today, there is literacy across the Middle East in much, much higher rates than they were, but there is still an enormous gap between those who rule the area, who glean all the benefits of the oil or whatever it happens to be, and the masses of people. I'll leave this slide up just for a minute. It's got my email address on it, and you can obviously, I'll be here next week, but if someone has a question or something they want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me at mumakeri@yahoo.com. If you didn't get it down now, you can get it from Suzanne or from the rabbi. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm happy to take questions. Initially, let's have questions about what I've been speaking about, and then afterwards, if we have time, we can spill over into questions about what's going on right now.
Muki, I have a question.
Sure.
Early in your presentation with the various slides, there were a group that you refer to as Orthodox. Is that like the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church? What was that?
Okay, so thank you for clarifying. It's not the Jewish Orthodox. If we look at the Catholic Church is a pyramid, and at the top of that pyramid is the Pope. The Orthodox Church is divided into regions, like the Catholic Church would have a cardinal or a cardinal in charge of a certain region. The Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, has a patriarch, and there is a Russian patriarch, a Ukrainian patriarch, a Syrian patriarch, a Greek patriarch. It's all the same church with regional differences. But that's all the Orthodox Church. Now, just to get a sense of the Catholic Church, the Pope can issue an edict and can change a rule. And it has happened, over the last 100 years. For the Orthodox Church to change, all the patriarchs have to agree. So it makes changes, but it's much, much slower. When I grew up, anyone who I met who was Orthodox was Greek. But the fact is, numerically, there are more Orthodox that are Arab or more Orthodox that are Russian than there are Greek. The church is still called the Greek Orthodox Church, the dominant but not dominant enough, because he can't impose. Patriarch was still the Greek patriarch. So that's who the Orthodox are.
Thank you.
I have a question about, I think it was a British geographer who basically drew the borders of, maybe it was just Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And I'm not sure, I don't remember what her name was. I remember reading about it during the Bush administration, because there was, we were fighting a war there. Who was that person, and why did she have the authority to do that?
So I don't know who the person is. I'm interested to hear more about this personality. But the colonial powers mapped out the map, and we saw all those straight lines. More than that, if we look, and I'll show you next week when we see a map of Israel, there's a straight line between Israel and Egypt, but there's also a little juggle, because when they drew the line, there was a bump on the table and the pencil jumped. This is ridiculous, but this is the truth. The pencil jumped, and then they gave a man a map and stones to go mark the border, and he was a low-ranking man. He followed the map, and he put the stones to mark the border where the border was. So that there is, we saw the randomness of the Jordanian border to separate the Syrians from accessing Saudi Arabia. These are completely colonial inventions, which is why many of the nations of the region are colonial nations who never really have a strong enough national identity. I don't know the particular story of this person that was sent to draw the border, but I will tell you that right now, our border with Lebanon, part of the conflict is about recognizing these made-up colonial borders. It's ongoing literally as we speak. There's one other thing I do want to say, which I didn't say before. I was just reminded of it. One of the things that the strongman did to unite their people was to find an external enemy. That external enemy could have been in the Iran-Iraq war, massive war with millions of dead. But the easiest one was to blame the Zionists. And so it was widely used by the Arab rulers as a way of deflecting criticism away from the internal problems onto an external enemy. But even if we take and not even if we take, if we include the total number of people killed in Israel-Arab wars going back to 1860 and until today, they're a fraction of the number of people killed in Middle East wars between other warring parties. A fact that is lost in the media today, but a fact that is easily Googleable. That was a long way off from what your question was, but I don't know who this woman is.
Gertrude Bell was her name.
Again, please tell me, because I want to look her up.
Gertrude Bell, B-E-L-L. Gertrude Bell.
Okay.
She was a British geographer.
Okay. I'll see if we can talk about it more next week. I'll see what I can find.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Well, the elephant in the room is, of course, what's going on today and how are you doing and what's your crystal ball that you don't have say about the situation?
So I'll start in the inner circle and build outwards. My city has been largely unaffected. We had 4 missile attacks. We did lose a lot of sons and daughters of the village and of the city in combat, but has been largely unaffected. My boys are not in the army. I'm not in the army. My nephew was in Gaza, but he's just been released. So we're kind of on that level. We're not deeply involved. My wife and boys have more or less got their regular routines. I am doing Zooms. I'm doing solidarity trips, which are starting to come more and more of. But if solidarity, I'm doing 8, 10, March, I've got 13 days scheduled, which is a fraction of the number of days I would typically be guiding or working. But, again, all things considered, I'm okay. I mean, I know, Rabbi, you were in Israel recently, right? And I know that people are coming, but there's very little tourism. It's more support, which is very important. Very different dynamic, very different places visited. I'm happy to be working. I'm happy that my wife is working. Relative to many people, even forget about the people who lost someone or have someone being held hostage, but economically we're managing. We're not like many people that have lost businesses or are unable to go to their business. We go one step further. When I last looked, which was just 5 minutes before I came on this call, the Hamas had still not given an answer to the attempt to have the release of some of the hostages and some kind of ceasefire. I'm not very optimistic about it happening. And I don't think that I think there's widespread Israeli support for returning the hostages, but it's not a blank check. People want to know what the price is to get the people back. Because if the price is leaving Hamas in a position where they can just do it again, it's a terrible, terrible dilemma. Last week I was down, not for the first time, but with a group of colleagues, and we had a different experience to the experience I've had when I've accompanied groups or when I've gone down to volunteer. A very intimate experience with some of our friends who, some of you met Chen, for example, but she shared, and I've been with Chen, who I've known for a long time, who I consider a friend. I was in contact with her on the morning of the event. She wasn't in Israel, but I still wrote, as soon as I heard, I wrote to her. A very, very intimate, very, very, details of what happened she shared with us. And it was, I'm a man of words, and I still don't have words even to describe hearing her stories about what was going on. That being said, we were down in the Gaza area for about 6 hours. We heard boom, boom, boom occasionally, our missiles, our soldiers. I've got a friend who lives near Tiberias, a guide who was joining us for the day. He's not even, he says that he's a smoker. So every evening, once he puts his kids to bed, he goes out and sits outside and has a cigarette. He can hear the war in Lebanon. He can hear the incoming missiles. The North, which is not making the media nearly as much, is very, very frightening. The capabilities that Hezbollah have compared to the capabilities that Hamas have, it will make this war look like child's play. If most of the Hamas missiles, many were smuggled in, but most of them were made in a bunker, buried under a mosque somewhere in the Gaza Strip, the Hezbollah missiles were made in a missile factory in North Korea or China or Russia or Iran. Their soldiers have been fighting in the Syrian civil war, are battle hardened, are much better trained, are much better equipped. They can hit, they have targeted weapons, not just statistical weapons. Hamas mostly fires weapons and hopes one of them will hit us. They have missiles that can go through a window like we have. So that is a big, big fear. There are in Israel in total 250,000 people that are out of their homes. The government has a plan to take the people of the South back. It was released in the paper today. There are not initially the homes that right border the Gaza Strip, but the places in other areas. Their missiles are so infrequent at the moment, and Hamas's capabilities are understood to have been so degraded that those places are not, that there's already a concrete plan to bring people back to those regions. The 90,000 people in the north, there's no plan to take them back yet. They can't go back because Hezbollah's lost 150 soldiers. And, we have degraded to some extent their military capabilities, but this is an enormous, enormous threat. Just to take it one step further, yesterday, not yesterday, today's still Sunday, this morning, we had a Zoom call for there's a collective of I think we're 15 or 18 guides that work for J2, the company that I do most of my work for, that are the kind of the in-house guides. And we had a meeting with the management of the company, kind of a picture of what's going on, and we were told that solidarity groups are coming, but no one is booking a trip to Israel for the summer. If nothing changes in the next few weeks, there will be no work in the summer either, and there'll be a solidarity here and there, but because this war. With Gaza, you could be in Tel Aviv and you could be in Jerusalem, and if there was an alarm, you had 90 seconds to go to your shelter, and it wasn't going to do that much damage. Hezbollah has missiles that can take out, malls or train stations or hotels for, if that were to be a target. So it is it's not making the media nearly as much, but I think that's the big concern, the concern that we have right now. We were very concerned about the threat to free passage and shipping and our link to the east. I drive a Korean car. my car, I always joke, my car made Aliyah, through Eilat. Well, now your government and their allies are hopefully disrupting that front. That was also a threat to us. But things are very, very brittle. And I haven't even spoken about the trauma that I personally am going through, where the country of my birth, in something that could have been from, Animal Farm or 1984, or one of those books where truth is not actually that whole case is just really, really upsetting. And a lot of my friends in South Africa that are still there, and family in South Africa, are very actually worried about Jewish life in South Africa at the moment, even though most ordinary South Africans are very Christian and very connected to Israel, but the bankrupt government is in the pockets of Iran because they need people to bail them out. So again, a long answer, Marsha, to your question, but happy to do that. Any other questions or comments?
Muki, I saw reports today that Hamas is filtering back into northern Gaza because of some sort of Israeli withdrawal, and they're seeking to reestablish governmental influence there. Have you heard anything about that?
Yes. So this is a whole, again, you already know I don't like short answers. So one of the challenges we face is that our current government is held in place by a few small, very extremist parties. And our current prime minister is there's a court case going against him. And any other coalition partners would make him accountable in the court case. So he's dependent on staying with the extremists. And therefore, he's not talking about a day after. What happens when the war's over? Who is going to be in control the day after the war? We've not yet, and it's driving the American administration crazy because we've had this war. We've lost hundreds of young men fighting. There's been devastation in Gaza, but what's happening afterwards? And because we want our economy to work, and because we want our students to go back to students, and because militarily in most of Gaza, Hamas has been totally degraded, not eradicated, but severely degraded. Israel has withdrawn also because there's lurking in the back of our mind that we might need to use these people to fight in the north. So Israel has withdrawn its reservists and they've gone back to university. My nephew that I mentioned, he came around on Thursday night and shared some of his experiences with us. School went back on the 31st of December, which was supposed to go back on the 18th of October. And he didn't go back to university until this last Tuesday because he was in Gaza until then. And so the government wanted to withdraw people to do all that. But because there's a vacuum, who has come into that vacuum? Hamas are in that vacuum. The American suggestion was that the Palestinian Authority, which controls the West Bank, should come in and control the area. Also Palestinians, etc. But that was vetoed by the allies of the prime minister. And so that hasn't happened. And so Hamas are in civil control. But we know that however many weapons storages or missile launching planes or tunnels we've destroyed, we know that we need to be there for another year or two to get them all. And so that's what's very, very worrying is, yes, they're not firing missiles from northern Gaza right now, but Hamas are reestablishing themselves as the governance. And that is that is a big problem from my perspective.
Well, Muki, well, we appreciate you being here, and it's getting late there for you. So we will let you go, and we'll see you next Sunday. And thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, so next Sunday we'll talk about Zionism, right?
What? Zionism.
I beg your pardon?
Okay.
I'm just going blank as to what we're talking about, but I have it written down. Don't worry, I have it prepared even. But I will, so I look forward to seeing you next week, Sunday. And like I say, if there are additional questions about things I said today, I'll be happy to discuss them with you. I wish you a good rest of the day and a good week, and I'll see you next week.
Good night.
Goodbye.